Thanks to everyone who's attending, both in person and online. Thank you very much to Dion and the conveners for asking me to speak. Thank you as well to my lovely assistant, Amy, who is not only chairing, but will be hopefully helping me with my slides. Quick general content warning. I'm going to talk about a bit about child loss, miscarriage, and really quite gross bodily fluids. It's obviously more than fine if anyone wants to tune out for that stuff or leave the room, but I'm not going to be talking about anything in too graphic detail. So this is very much a work in progress, and I'd actually really value your comments as well as your questions at this stage. So if there are any more of a comment than a question, that's actually all right today. And I'd just like to draw your attention to this this first picture I've included here. It's an allegory of charity from 1655, and you'll see that Charity there is holding like a blazing heart. And it's a really evocative image of the heart of the emotions, and there's a link to Charity as well that will become clear in my paper. But I'm going to begin with a vignette from Alice Thornton's first book of My Widowed Condition. This is one of her 4 autobiographical books. So in February 1655, Alice Thornton was in bed recovering from giving birth to her second child, a daughter called Elizabeth, or Betty for short, when her maid called out to her. Alice's 1-year-old daughter, Alice, known as Nally, in her cot in the next room, was experiencing convulsive fits, and her maid, Jane Flower, and the midwife, Jane Brimmer, were acting to save her. The fits stopped and started, and the physical and mental effect that this sudden grief had on Thornton was profound. Slide. All of the Thornton quotes I'm using in this paper I've modernised for ease. I was lying in the chamber next to her and did hear her when she came out of them, i.e. her fits, to give great shrieks, and so suddenly that it frightened me extremely. And all the time of this poor child's illness, I myself was at death's door by the extreme excess of those upon the fright and terror that came upon me with so great floods that I was spent and my breath lost. My strength departed from me, and I could not speak for fainting and was dispirited. My dear mother and aunt and friends did not expect my life, but were overcome with sorrow for me. Nor durst they tell me in what condition my dear Nally was in, lest in her fits, lest grief for her added to my own extremity with loss of blood might have extinguished my miserable life. That sounds quite melodramatic, but we'll come back to this process later. What Thornton experiences here is some sort of dangerous flux of humours, probably uterine bleeding. She had, after all, just given birth. And what happened was that the maids then moved Nally to a room further away where her mother couldn't hear her cries and screams, which they clearly thought was putting Alice Thornton in mortal danger. As well as the flooding from her womb, the shock of the incident had made Thornton's milk dry up, and she wasn't able to breastfeed her newborn daughter for about 2 weeks after that. But the story didn't end there. 2 weeks later, just as Thornton was able to breastfeed Betty again, Nally fell into convulsions once more. A maid ran into Alice and said that Nally was dead or nearly dead, and once again, the physical effect on Thornton was intense, which did so suddenly affright me, being weak as before, and this flood came down upon me, and they had much to do to get me carried safe into my bed again. And there was I kept betwixt hopes and fears for myself and my dear child for 2 days or more, every life expected when the other or both to have gone. But behold, the great and wonderful goodness of my glorious Lord God, who kills and makes alive again, he wounds and heals, brings down to the grave and raises up again. Oh, who is so great a God as our God, which has done these things for me and my dear child, and let us live to see the wonders of the Lord our God. So luckily, Nally did once again recover, according to Thornton, thanks ultimately to the will of God. So as I've said, Thornton here is describing a process that might seem quite melodramatic to the modern reader. She experiences sudden grief, that's Nally's illness. This leads to a huge flux in her humours, what she calls a flood, and I'll come back to this later, and the drying up of her milk. She's close to death or dying, according not only to herself, but to others around her, her mother, her aunt, her maids. But God steps in to deliver her from this terrible fate. This is a process that Thornton describes throughout her autobiographical books, and it's this process that my paper this evening is about. So what I'm going to do is begin with a brief biography of Thornton and introduce her books before describing some other examples of this shock, grief, near flux, near death, deliverance process in her writings. I'm then going to place the process in context of both Thornton's writings and late 17th century understandings of medicine and the body. Ultimately, Thornton's reaction to grief, which I'll define also, can be placed in the context of mainstream 17th century medical concepts of the body and the passions, what we would today call the emotions. And I just like you to bear this word emotions in mind as the paper goes on and just think about its possible etymological associations, because that's going to become clear. Next slide, please. Alice Thornton, here's a brief kind of timeline of her life. She was born into an aristocratic Yorkshire family on the 13th of February, 1626. She's the youngest daughter of Christopher Wansford of Kirkington and his wife Alice, née Osborne. So the family relocated to Ireland in the 1630s when Wansford became master of the rolls, and later briefly Lord Deputy of Ireland in 1640 before his unexpected death later that year, aged 48. While in Dublin, Thornton tells us that she was educated in a way that befitted a young lady of her status. She learned to read and write, speak French, play instruments, and dance. So she's a highly educated woman, very well read. The family returned to Yorkshire in the aftermath of Wansford's death and the Dublin uprising in 1641. Funnily enough, as royalists, they weren't particularly welcome, via Cheshire. They were then delayed getting back to Yorkshire for some 3 years due to the outbreak of fighting due to the First English Civil War in 1642. They finally settled at her mother's jointure property, Hipswell Hall, in 1644. But then the family suffered further hardship when eldest son and heir to the Wansford title, George, had his property sequestered in the late 1640 due to his supposedly taking part in the Battle of Marston Moor in 1644, so royalist connections. And the family then suffered further hardship when George died an untimely death, drowned trying to cross the River Swale in 1651. It was then that Thornton reluctantly married down in order to secure her family's future to local gentryman William Thornton of East Newton. Between 1652 and 1667, Thornton was pregnant a total of 9 times. She gave birth to 7 children who lived beyond that, 3 of whom survived childhood. She buries a lot of children and obviously deals with an awful lot of grief in that situation. So it doesn't end there. On the 17th of September 1668, William Thornton died aged 44 during a scandal that was circulating about the Thornton family and Alice Thornton's relationship with her daughter Nally's suitor, Thomas Comber. We're going to come back to this. Clearing her name from the damage caused by these rumours was a fixation of Thornton's in her writing. So her story is less one of kind of riches to rags than riches to fewer riches. So what we can say is that when she died on the 1st of February, when she died and was buried on the 1st of February 1707, she was in much less privilege than she had been born into. So So it was after William's death and in the aftermath of the Danby rumours and Nally's marriage to Comber that Thornton began to write her memoirs, of which we have now located all 4. This first small one you see here is a book of remembrances. It's teeny. There's the first book of my life, and then the first and second books of my widowed condition. And below, I've just put the shorthand that we use in the Thornton team to refer to these volumes. And this gives some context as well as to the size of these volumes. I've tried to sort of illustrate their relatively different sizes, but the Book of Remembrances is really teeny, whereas book 3 is actually quite a large volume. Precisely dating the writing of each of these books is impossible, although it is thought the Book of Remembrances was written first, and book 3 was perhaps written as late as the 1690s. And there is some evidence in book 3 that shows us that Thornton began to work on book 1 around 1669, but she was still inserting things into that later. So it's really, really hard to pinpoint when exactly each book's written. And until recently, the only editions were Jackson's late 19th century sort of patchwork edition of parts of what we call books 1, 2, and 3 that attempted to make Thornton's account chronological and left out a great deal of material. And then the late Ray Anselman, who sadly passed away in April last year, who was very, very important to our project, he did an edition of what we call book 1, the first book of my life. In 2018 and then 2019, our project PI Cordelia Beattie relocated 2 of Thornton's missing books, the Book of Remembrances and book 2. You can read about this in a blog on the Thornton Books website. It rather importantly began with Cordelia's dad in a pub in Ludlow. Now all 4 manuscripts are accounted for. 2 are in Durham Cathedral Library and 2 are in the British Library. And the Alice Thornton's Books team is producing a digital edition of all 4 books, which will be fully available next year. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of the website. This is the big plug. We're obviously funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. We have blogs and news events updating regularly on the site, and we're planning a sample release of the first 20 pages of Book of Remembrances very soon. So our website URL is there, our Twitter is there, our Facebook is there. Please do follow us, please give us a like, please keep checking in on the website. Okay, so that's the kind of marketing over. As one of 2 postdoctoral fellows on the project, I've spent the last 18 months reading, transcribing, rereading, editing, re-editing, coding, and modernising Thornton's writings. I've literally read each of these books tens of times for different purposes. So it's a real pleasure to now be able to look into more deeply into certain themes within the books, because I have spent a long time with them. So it won't be a kind of surprise to many people here that the 17th century was a time when life writing really sort of took off. Diaries, autobiographies, letters written by high and low status men and women of this time about their own lives and experiences. Perhaps most famous being Diary of Samuel Pepys, not my favourite person, famously. But many women at this time also produced life writing, among others. Lady Anne Clifford kept a diary. Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, amazing woman. She wrote an autobiography, as well as her many works on like science, philosophy, and literature. And then more low status women wrote memoirs too, such as Anne Wentworth. So that Thornton, an educated and high status woman, wrote 4 autobiographies isn't strange, but what is unique about Thornton's books is that they're not chronological volumes, as you might expect. Rather, the books write and rewrite Thornton's story. Sometimes the same incident appears in all 4 books, such as the death of Thornton's 18-month-old daughter, Betty, who we opened with in 1656. She describes that event in all 4 books. Whereas some events appear only in 1 book, such as when she recounts seeing the total solar eclipse of March 1652, and that's only in book 2. The books were probably written, probably intended to be circulated among Thornton's friends and family, in no small part to dispel these rumours that were circulating about her, and to prove that God was on her side. And in fact, we do have some internal evidence in book 3 that the books were actually circulated and returned to Thornton. So Alice Thornton's writing for a particular audience appears among the aristocracy and gentry in Yorkshire and perhaps beyond. The books are also written in a particular style, often and especially in book 1, recording occasions where Thornton and her family were delivered from almost certain death in an array of situations: near drownings, war, illness, childbirth, accidents, eating bad lobster, and undigested turbot, and more. So this obviously frames, it firstly means that these sources are a really good place to look for accounts of illness, because naturally she's talking about those kinds of things. The cure or the death in these situations is ultimately up to the will of God, really. Another factor to bear in mind is that the composition of the books is that she's writing with hindsight. The chronological gap between the event she's describing and her recounting of it could be as much as 30 or 40 years. This means that much of what she records is viewed through a particular lens, one with the benefit of hindsight, and taking into account her religious outlook. So Alice Thornton was a devout Anglican Protestant and royalist with a deep belief in divine providence. Things happen because God wills it, whether those things are good or bad. And this is a framework in which she explains her deliverances from death, but also the tragedies in her life, such as the deaths of many of her children. It's comforting to think that this happened for a reason, whether you understand that reason or not. So that's Alice's life in a nutshell, although there's much more I could say about her if I had time. We can examine her life in books from so many angles: gender, war, religion, law, and of course, illness. So let's now turn to this process I've put here, which I call the very snappily titled Sudden Grief Flux Near Death Deliverance process in Thornton's books, in order to examine that phenomenon further. So, much of the trouble encountered by Thornton throughout her life was down to the bad decisions of the men around her: her husband, her brothers, her son, various other male relations and friends. Her husband, William, a man prone to fits of paralysis and melancholy, was not a financially prudent man, and this led to some extremely difficult situations for Thornton and her children. The big betrayal came 2 years before William's death in August 1666. and Thornton discovered that William had cut her two surviving daughters, Nally and Catherine, out of their inheritance of the family property at Alice Thornton in order to pay off debts. This was a result of Thornton's nephew by marriage, lawyer Henry Best, whom she had trusted to look over her legal papers, convincing her that one settlement needed amending. In fact, what Best did was introduce a loophole that meant William could cut off her heirs without her consent, and then he went and told William about it, who promptly cut off his daughters to settle a debt, an act of desperation, presumably. They didn't tell Alice about this, but she found out about this in August 1666. And when she found out about this, the effect on her once again was profound. And this is how she recounts the experience in book 2. Sorry, Amy, thanks. Yeah, here's how she describes the experience in book 2. The very grief I apprehended was so great at that time on the discovery to me that it did force me to that miscarriage, which I had and long continued sickness by the excess of floods, which lasted a long time on me. And she describes this illness in much more detail in book 1. After this happened, I fell into a very sad and desperate condition upon Saturday, the 16th of August, 1666, being then about 8 weeks gone. So she's about 8 weeks pregnant. The violence thereof continued a long time after Dr. Whitty was with me, and for 3 days he did not expect my life, so that he was compelled to use all his art for my preservation. But it pleased God, upon the use of his medicines, that extremity a little abated, he leaving me in a hopeful way of recovery, only said I must not expect to be restored till about the latter end of October, all which time I was in continual faintings upon the renewal of that extremity, so that my loss of spirits and strength, etc., was so great that it was expected I should have fallen into a deep consumption, and I continued exceedingly feeble and weak till the candle was following. Just a quick glossary here. I'll come back to this word flood. This describes, in the senses that I've come across it, in the context of the time, a sort of, usually it's a postpartum flux of uterine bleeding. I do need to investigate this further, and this is where I'd really like some feedback. I wonder if Thornton's using it in a more general way to mean a sort of surge or swelling of humours inside the body, and we're going to come to the humours shortly. Extremity here just refers to an extreme of illness. Consumption, which has obviously been linked to tuberculosis more recently, in this time and in this context, refers to a wasting of the body. Candlemas is 2nd of February, so she's talking about early February. So both Thornton's husband and nephew had betrayed her so profoundly that it caused her to suffer a miscarriage and months of excessive humoral disruption. Those around her, again, believed her illness to be potentially fatal, and again, it was God's favour that granted the medicine administered by the family doctor, Robert Whitty, the power to work. In the end, Thornton actually remained ill for about 7 months until February 1667, so that's a really significant period of illness. So the next big example of this process, the sudden grief, flux, near-death deliverance, in Thornton books happened 2 years later in the summer 1668. 1668 was really her annus horribilis, I think, if she had one. Her niece by marriage, Anne Danby, was living with the family at East Newton Hall near Oswald Kirk, and this is in North Yorkshire. Anne was married to Alice's nephew, Christopher Danby. The previous year, Christopher's elder brother Thomas, heir to the Danby estate, had been murdered during a tavern brawl in London. It's not clear what happened exactly after this, but there was now great animosity between Thomas's widow Margaret and her sister-in-law Anne. You know, I imagine inheritance was a big part of what was happening here. Anne, it seemed, had nowhere to go, and along with her children and servants, some of her servants, she was taken in by the Thorntons in an act of charity. It's not actually clear where Christopher was living at this time, or if indeed he and Anne were still in a functional marriage. We don't know. Additionally to this, 2 years earlier in 1666, 21-year-old Thomas Comber had become curate of Holy Trinity Stonegrave, the Thorntons parish church. He became good friends with both William and Alice, and ended up lodging at East Newton with them. This is a little bit grim to those of us in the room here today, because it goes against our kind of sensibilities. But Alice's eldest daughter Nally, then 12, caught 21-year-old Thomas's eye. By the age of consent to marry is 14 this time, and he intended to marry her when she came of age at 14. And Comber got loads of offers of marriage. You know, Comber was quite the catch. He was really going places. You know, he did. He ended up Dean of Durham. So clearly the kind of man you'd want for your daughter. But he did away, but he wanted to marry Nally. And by 1668, when Nally was 14, they were sort of engaged to be married. But that summer, Thornton discovered that her lodger, Anne Danby, her niece, and her maid had been spreading rumours about Thornton's relationship with Comber. Thornton tells us that Danby tried to break off the match between Comber and Nally because she had an interest in a marriage between Comber and her friend Mary or Martha Batt. We're not sure which. Thornton uses both names in different accounts, so it's not very helpful. Comber was a man who said he was going places, and Anne saw security for herself if her friend married him. Essentially, these rumours that were spread implied there was something more than friendship to Thornton's relationship with Comber, that she wanted Nally to marry him so she could carry on some kind of extramarital affair with him. And we don't have any evidence to suggest that the relationship was anything other than a sort of close friendship. As I mentioned earlier, the Danby scandal and resulting rumours were an obsession of Thornton's, and it seems her book, as I say, were partially written to circulate to demonstrate her exemplary character, especially a recurring theme in book 3, which is probably the one that was written latest. So on finding out that these rumours had been spread by people within her own household, Thornton immediately became very ill. She describes a very great and dangerous condition of sickness and weakness of body and afflicted mind on the account of my evil enemy's slanders with an excessive grief thereon. In book 2, she says, my fainting and weakness was so great and returned so strongly upon me all that night, and for 2 days after that dear friends and children did not expect but when I should have departed, having lost so much blood in the flood that broke upon me, by excess of grief at the first knowing of my slanderous accusation by Mrs. Anne Danby and her maid Barbara Todd. And in book 3, she describes this again. Now, after these sad troubles of mine which I suffered, I knew not from whom, nor for what, but made the scorn of many. And yet the Lord gave me favour and pity of my dear friends. I was wounded in my soul, and with great sorrows and violent griefs did fall into great extremity of weakness, and none thought that I should have lived. And while they were yet in the house, I had no peace or ease or sleep or comfort, till my gracious God did hear my sorrows and sufferings and gave me comfort of my husband and children and friends who mourned and wept with me and gave me what redress they could, begging of God for mercy to relieve me in this great extremity. Again, Thornton describes here the sudden grief, flux, near-death deliverance process, the illness caused by betrayal of someone she not only thought was a friend, but to whom she had opened up her house and hospitality and provided charity. Thinking back to this allegory of charity that we saw at the start. And just a month or two after the Danby rumours came to light, William Thornton, a man who, as previously mentioned, had been prone to fits of paralysis, that's what we call fits of the palsy, died aged 44 during a visit to Malton to confront one Charles Tancred of Arden at Malton Fair. It seems Tancred had heard the rumours that were circulating about Alice, and Comber had been repeating them. William's sister Frances and her husband Timothy Portington lived in Malton, and Timothy happened to be an apothecary, so it was lucky William was there when he became ill, and Portington was able to treat him. Sadly, the treatments didn't work, and William died on the 17th of September 1668. His body brought back to East Newton in a carriage the next day. Still struggling with the effects of the Danby rumours, the grief again once had a severe effect on Thornton, who said, the illness now renewed on me again, so that I was reduced to great extremity and none hope for my life for a long time. And but for the great and charitable kindness of friends which comforted me and prayed with me and for me, in that most sad and desperate condition I had utterly fainted, and my soul had departed in that languishing condition, having now the heavy wrath of my God joined to the malice of my enemies, who had taken from me my greatest earthly comfort away, leaving a desolate and helpless widow, and my 3 dear children, orphans. Again, the same vocabulary that we've seen before in the description of this process. Nally's illness in 1655, the betrayal by William and Henry in 1666, and the Danby rumours followed by William's death in 1668. And we shouldn't assume Thornton's being lax about the meanings of the terms she uses here. As I've said, she was a well-read, highly educated woman with an access to a great deal of books, ideas, and knowledge. Grief, as kind of conceived of by Thornton, and in fact many other men and women in her time, was a specific passion or emotion caused by a loss or a potential loss of a loved one via death, of a relationship via betrayal, financial security via mismanagement, reputation via rumours. And this matches up with Elizabeth Hodgson, whose 2014 monograph, Grief in Women Writers in the English Renaissance, mourning is a response to an ending, whether it be implied, real, imagined, or felt. So grief, yes, it's about the death of a person. And I think today we think of grief as being very specifically about mourning a dead person. But grief, as Thornton imagines it, is a sudden shock of the idea of a loss or a real loss. The result of grief was a flood, which, again, I've said, I'm not sure if Thornton's using that to refer to a general imbalance of humours in the body. In all cases, Thornton and those around her genuinely believed her life was in danger, and in all cases, it was God who ultimately delivered her from this terrible situation. So let's now examine this process in the context of early modern medicine. Thank you, Amy. So late 17th century medicine was at its core really no different from medieval or antique medicine that preceded it. Galenic humoral theory, the main orthodox framework of thinking about the body and its illnesses, had dominated the medical landscape since the 2nd century and was itself based on the much earlier Greek medicine of the Hippocratic school. So as you can see in this wonderful chart here, ancient and medieval medicine and early modern medicine operated on the belief that the body contained 4 humours: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, associated with the 4 states, which are hot, cold, wet, and dry. There's also 4 ages of man, there's 4 seasons, there's 4 elements. And so this kind of series of 4 makes a really nice little neat package. Humoral theory is also really flexible. So that's why it's enabled to last for so long. Each individual seems to have a different humoral makeup. So, you say someone's of a sanguine disposition or a melancholy disposition. And it's when this makeup's put out of balance that illness resulted. Different things could affect the humours, including and mainly the Galenic 6 non-natural, which I've listed here. These are air, food and drink, sleep and waking, motion and rest, expulsion and retention, and the passions. And it's the final one that concerns us here, the passions, what we would today call the emotions, that word again. It is true that at this time, there were new ideas about medicine and the body that had begun to circulate. So in the 1620s, William Harvey discovered the role of blood in circulation, but the impact of this discovery was limited in any sort of immediate sense. While the 17th century and the 18th century were a time of change in terms of medical theory, in reality, medical practice, the concept of the laity, changed little, certainly in terms of the core ideas about the humours in the body. And this framework still dominated medicine until as late as the 19th century in some ways. Now, the passions themselves were a topic of lively discussion in Thornton's time. The period sort of from 1500s to 1700 is kind of a time when there's a lot of writing about the emotions and the passions and the effects on the body. So, for example, you might have heard of Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, first published in 1621, published 5 times more over the next 17 years with extensive expansions and additions. Mind and body were not considered separate in humoral medicine. Now, Descartes died in 1650, and he obviously postulated this theory of mind-body dualism, but again, like Harvey in circulation, that doesn't mean that everybody just went, oh, right, Descartes, yeah, let's think about things differently. Concepts aren't adopted wholesale and immediately. Medicine in this time was generally still Galenic medicine, dominated by this very elastic framework of the humours. And the passions affected the humours, the liquids that moved around the body. It is quite a gross topic for me to be examining, I have to say. And some of the ways we talk about our emotions today still reflect these old ways of thinking, being moved, bursting with joy, heartbroken, and of course, taking things to heart. And I asked you to think about this word emotion at the start, which first came into use around this Thornton's time. It is, of course, etymologically related to the idea of movement and motion. Our concepts of mind and body may have changed, but our language hasn't in a lot of ways. So before we go into a discussion of the early modern passions, it's important here to include a word of warning about ding ding, retrospective diagnosis. Essentially, I'm not trying to work out here what's actually wrong with Thornton. It's not historically interesting to me to point out that extreme emotions can cause diarrhea, sweating, vomiting, weeping. As Ulinka Rublak asks in her seminal article, may it have been the case that the early modern period, not only that bodily existence was conceived of as differently from today, but also that this body actually behaved differently. Now, obviously, we can't know the answer to this, but it's safe to say that the experience of illness and how it was conceived of by Thornton and her contemporaries is really what's interesting to me here, rather than trying to see things through a lens of modern diagnostics. So that's not what I'm trying to do here. So my research into Thornton, grief and illness builds on the work of 2 historians who've written on this topic, both focusing mainly on continental material. The first is the aforementioned article that I mentioned by Ulinka Rublak, The Early Modern Body and the Emotions, translated into English by Pamela Selwyn. That was 2002. And this is one of the first pieces of work to address the questions of what early modern lay people, i.e. not doctors, thought the effect of the emotions was on their bodies. The second is Michael Stolberg's 2018 article, Emotions and the Body in Early Modern Medicine, in which he laments that up to that point, the bulk of work being done on the sort of history of emotions in the early modern period focused disproportionately on kind of non-medical sources and only in the English language. So he examines the writings of both medical practitioners and lay people with a sort of focus on France and Germany. And this doesn't mean we can't use this work when we look at early modern England. Texts and ideas circulated to and from the continent. The ideas and experiences of French and German medics and lay people are relevant to the situation in late 17th century England and to Alice Thornton's perceptions of what was happening to her own body. Britain doesn't exist in a vacuum, never has. What Rublack and Stolberg show is that both medical writers and lay people in the early modern period believed that strong negative emotions could have a fatal effect on the body by affecting the flow of humours. And these negative emotions can include anger, sadness, jealousy, and of course, grief. Slide, please. As well as the continental account studied by Rublack and Stolberg, English medical writers of the 17th century wrote about the potentially lethal effects of grief. In 1633, the Northampton physician James Hart warned in his Diet of the Diseased. Sounds like a sort of satanic rock band, Diet of the Diseased. This grief and sorrow, then, if too much yielded unto, will to some procure irrecoverable consumptions, will dry up the brain and marrow of their bones, hinder concoction, and so procure crudities by means of want of rest, and by consequent prove a cause of many dangerous diseases. Now, as the excess is hurtful to all, so to some far more than to others, especially to lean, spare bodies, dry brains, persons inclining to melancholy, and women especially if with child, young children who by reason of their sex and age are less able to resist such passions, and some by natural constitution very timorous, are more liable to danger by reason of fears and sudden frights in other people. And the risk was great. He went on to say, Galen himself makes answer that one may die of these passions, and to this do all physicians assent, and experience makes it so appear. So grief was fatally dangerous, because it disturbed the humours to such a degree that they could simply cause the body to stop working. Next slide, please. As touched on by Hart, excessive grief was a gendered passion as well in the early modern period. As Elizabeth Hodgson notes, the Flemish theologian and Protestant reformer Andreas Hyperius in the 16th century wrote in The Practice of Preaching, all that be of sound judgment do think it very uncomely and womanish to lament without measure, and to take so impatiently the chance that happens in comforting, so to increase sorrow, as that a womanish kind of wailing and shrieking should follow, does incur reprehension. Hyperius says that it becomes men chiefly to embrace all manhood and prowess in the face of death. And poet Henry King in the 17th century describes his effeminate grief as making him inadequate and inarticulate, unfitting for his sex. And there's a quote from him there: "Betray more of the weaker sex than is fit for my own." Therefore, the way Thornton describes her reaction to grief would perhaps be excessive if she was a man, but it fits with how certain male writers perceived the passions of women. Additionally, of course, women don't exist in a vacuum. They lived in a world with men, corresponded with them, absorbed their ideas. Now, as Rublack points out, within the humoral system, the body wasn't conceived of as one in which organs were the principal agents, as they are today. They really thought of their bodies as very, very differently to how we do, and I think it's really difficult to put yourself in that way of thinking. So early modern bodies are powered by the humours, and they're moved around it by the organs. Humours kind of sloshed and flowed within the body, and they were purged if they were excessive by urine, feces, sweat, tears, spit, vomit, and other means. This is why bloodletting and urine examination, for example, was so ubiquitous in this kind of way of thinking about medicine. The image of the pre-modern doctor very often includes holding a urine flask up to the light to examine it. And obviously bloodletting is a very common way of doing medicine. And I say this is really alien to our way of thinking about bodies, because we think you need your blood, keep your blood inside you, for goodness sake. Let's take this example of the Imperial Ambassador, great name, Ogier Ghislain de Busbecq. Travelling in 1574, in his first report to Emperor Maximilian II, he related that yesterday I delayed one day at Salzburg to look after my health. For the same reason, I also spent one day at Augsburg. From the third stage back from Vienna, my blood began to flow from me in large quantities along with urine, but without any sensation or pain or greater inconvenience of any sort. Now, I'm not sure about you, but if blood started flowing from me in large quantities along with urine, I would be really alarmed. However, Ogier just seems to see this as a kind of, he's been jostled by the carriage on his journey. It sloshed the humours around him. And so this is just how they're kind of being kind of purged from his body. It's matter of fact. I would not feel matter of fact about that if it was me. A further example of sudden grief causing bodily problems is found in Stolberg's examination of the medical notes of the late 16th century physician Leonard Fernheiser. This includes an example of one Simon Rota, a patient who had suffered grief and sorrow from an unexpected death. This resulted in his left thigh being struck by disease in the middle of the night, and all night he felt a tearing in the limb. The next morning he couldn't lift his leg and needed a stick to walk. I don't know whether he got better or not. that information wasn't included in the source. But as Rota conceived of it then, refracted through Thurnhuis's doctor's records, sudden grief had caused this humoral imbalance inside his body, and it was so serious that he couldn't walk. So many lay people then had a very clear idea of what was going on inside their bodies. The movement of the humours was key, and the effect of strong emotions such as sudden grief on the body. So just to wrap up, my investigations into Alice Thornton grief, humoral destruction and deliverance is very much a work in progress, as I've said. And what I've hoped to do here is lay out the foundations for further work and raise some questions. I just want to end by touching on friendship and betrayal in relation to grief. In her article, Rue Black discusses 16th century philosopher Francis Bacon's ideas about friendship and opening up the heart. Bacon was, of course, writing in the particularly masculine context of the early modern male intellectual. Bacon said that who you choose to open up your heart to was important because the purpose of friendship was the ease and discharge of the fullness and swellings of the heart. So unburdening yourself to someone who was not a good friend could have the opposite effect and could be dangerous. And this is really interesting in the context of Alice Thornton's grief caused by betrayal from loved ones, her husband, her nephew, her friend. Anne Danby had been invited to live with the Thornton family with her children when she had nowhere to go. So this betrayal was especially difficult to tolerate. And the fact is that in many of these examples that I spoke of earlier of Thornton being very ill, it was friendship and good friends that came to her to help her to heal. They were literally trying to act to mend a broken heart. So Thornton wasn't being melodramatic when she discussed her reaction to grief, and there's no reason to assume her accounts are particularly exaggerated. As I hope to have shown, she was a highly educated, well-read woman who described what she thought was happening within her body in precise terms. Moreover, this was in line with how both medical writers and lay people in England and on the continent conceived of health and illness in the late 17th century. And I'm just going to leave you with a nice selection of the heart symbols peppered throughout Thornton's books, both representing the actual word heart mid-text and as a decoration in the borders. It seems Thornton really did take things to heart because that's precisely how she conceived of sudden grief acting on her body. Thank you.